I'd like to talk about Braudel's distinction of towns, his types of towns. This is the typology which develops in the last chapter, The Towns and Cities, of his first volume. So this sort of sets the scene for what was unique about European towns. So the three distinctions are: there is the town that sort of grades into its hinterland, which means that it is sort of a part of the hinterland. It is still very much dependent upon the product of that hinterland. So this town is the first type of town. I have some quotations about it. The ancient Greek or Roman city was open to the surrounding countryside and on terms of equality with it. This is on page 515. So what are the characteristics of this kind of town? Country people found refuge in the town at times of crisis. The town was not closed. Towns were a product of the surrounding agricultural class and hadn't much time, more than a few centuries, to develop a different identity. So they did not feel themselves as different people in the strict sense of the word from the surrounding countryside. And another quote: the village round about had their craftsmen and forgers. This is important because the villages around had their own industry, which sort of kept them at a position of equality with the town. Now the second type is the closed city, a self-sufficient unit. What are the characteristics of this? Distinct identity, boundary, and security. So the countryside is isolated from the town. Full citizens were a jealous minority. It was very difficult to become a citizen of this kind of town. The townspeople mistrustful of outsiders. And there's a quotation, when the country people entered the town, you could hear people say, "Back to the plow, shirkers." And the industry of the town, their profits belong to the town, to its authorities, and to its merchant entrepreneurs. So the whole vibrant economic life of the town would give its fruit to its merchants, and the surrounding countryside would, of course, it would supply the town, but it was isolated from the town in both economic and social terms, which means that it would not share in the profits, the dynamism of the town. And the final characteristic that I've noted of this kind of town is that they were organized around monopolies of trade, guilds. And these guilds, these trade monopolies were so powerful that their incentives could change, and consequently the economic decisions would change. Which is to say that if the guilds thought it was profitable to let the surrounding, the tradesmen or the artisans of the surrounding countryside get in the town or to trade with them, if they found it profitable to their own interests, they would do it. And if they did not, they would not do it. So these guilds sort of dictated the whole characteristic, the premise of how this town dealt with the countryside. This is the second type of town, and Braudel will use this typology later on in the chapter to argue that Europe was very much unique in having this type of vibrant town with its own distinct commercial life, with its own beating heart, independent of a prince. Now the third type of town, which is very common in the east of Europe, even in Europe, is subjugated towns of early modern times. The prince exercised supreme power, had his way with the town. He left to the town nobility their share and imposed upon them higher and higher obligations. He tried to control. And now this is a quote, like Charles XIV, a lieutenant of police. Through a lieutenant of police, he tried to control the town. So this lieutenant of police being established in Paris by Charles XIV is sort of a precedent for what the princes were trying to do. They were trying to sort of get full control of the town, which in which they were very much dependent for their revenues, and upon which they would later model other cities. And I have a note about this, that the big cities of the East and Far East were little more than imperial capitals. These are my notes, these are not quotes. Their aristocracy was completely subservient to the prince. Their freedoms were his whims. Capitals were transplanted. A whole prosperous town would be abandoned if the prince denied it his court. Now this is a quote. When Aurangzeb, the Mughal emperor, embarked on the journey which brought him as far as Kashmir in 1663, the whole town followed him because they could not live without his favors and liberal liberality. So this kind of princely subjugation of towns, Braudel will use in contrast to the self-sufficient towns of Europe, where the aristocracy could live without the prince, where the aristocracy in fact dictated decisions, where the aristocracy in fact merged into the merchant class, so that this entrepreneurial spirit would pay off in a social mobility sense for the merchants and for the aristocrats, and where citizenship was prized because this access to this entrepreneurial class had the ability to make them even immune to the whims of the princess. But is there an order in which these towns develop? Braudel says that roughly speaking, the first kind of town, which sort of grades into the countryside, precedes the second kind of town, and the second precedes the third. That is to say, the town is dependent upon the countryside, and then it develops a separate identity. And then it is part of a larger commercial life, a vibrant surrounding territory, and is later subjugated by a prince who controls multiple towns and multiple countrysides. This would be the rough process of development of towns, but it is by no means always the case. That is what Braudel argues. For as an extreme example of the second type of town, he uses Venice, which could afford to isolate itself completely as an entity, as its identity was Venetian. And we saw that the great Mughal emperor's example is an extreme of the third kind, and we see that those towns in Greece, where the peasants during times of war could just walk into the city and find shelter there, and the people in the city would protect them, would consider it a legitimate way of escape, is the exemplary kind of the first kind of town. So that is it for this video, and Braudel's chapter is going to talk about many towns from St. Petersburg to London to see how well this typology works, to see how well he can describe these towns in these terms, that is to say, in terms of how the town deals with its countryside, in terms of how the prince dictates its security, in terms of how much independent it is from its countryside. So this kind of typology Braudel is going to prove is very useful, and I think I agree with him until now.